What's up, y'all? Selena Castillo with Duke Women's Basketball here, and I am very excited to be presenting virtually to you. Very thankful, of course, to the WBCA for this opportunity, and thankful for the work that they do year-round to help grow our game. I'll be talking about social media, branding, creative content, all within the digital landscape today. I'm the creative director for our program, which means I manage our social media accounts. I create the content to go on those accounts. I work closely with our coaches and our student athletes on their personal branding. So a lot of complexities, right, to this topic. It can go a lot of different directions, but I really want to keep it short, simple, and something that everyone can get out of it. So one note I will say is the kind of agenda for this. We're going to touch on the digital landscape as a whole and what that might mean. We're going to touch on social media best practices and how to build an audience on social media. And then thirdly, we'll of course talk about storytelling and how to do that effectively from a program account or an individual account. So here it is, the agenda, and here are the timestamps for these various topics so that if you wanted to skip ahead, you can go ahead and do so to the topic that most interests you. So having said that, let's just get to it.
First, I'm going to talk about analyzing the digital landscape. My goal with this segment is simply to provide a 10,000-foot view of what this digital world really is. Social media is, of course, part of digital, but it is not all of digital. And I think that's an important discernment to have when you're considering and analyzing your digital strategy. Additionally, we definitely want to consider the relationship between brand, social, and creative in the digital world. So the brand, I represent it by a heart specifically because to me, the brand part of this is the relationship, right? You use digital channels, you use social media to build that relationship and build that brand. But at the end of the day, I'll be saying this a lot, you're dealing with humans, you need to tap into emotion in order to really build this brand, this gut feeling, whatever, this vehicle to tell a story, this brand that we're trying to build. Social comes into play in the digital space along with some of the other channels I'll be referring to, because that's the concept of communication. At the end of the day, a brand is great, but if you don't really have means to communicate your messages, you're kind of going to be operating in a vacuum. Lastly, of course, creative, being creative, expressing creativity in many different ways, whether it's visually, graphic design, of course, videos, motion graphics, or even just the way you phrase something, the way you communicate something. The goal there needs to be to leave an impression. And I will say another thing I will be repeating a lot is sometimes simple is the most effective strategy. So creative does not always mean complex, overly produced, ridiculous Power 5 resources. Sometimes simple is actually going to be the most creative approach you could take in the digital space. An ideal brand strategy will encompass all aspects of digital, not just social media. An analogy I can give right here is, tickets. Everyone wants to sell tickets. Let's say you're only trying to sell tickets on social media. You are probably missing a lot of steps that need to occur before effectively selling tickets and getting consumers to buy on social media. So all aspects of digital. So what are some of those aspects? Email is a huge one. Email, I think, is one of the most effective channels to really getting a consumer to take action and spend money on whatever it is you're trying to sell. Of course, social media, very much a digital channel. An athletics website, important to consider the type of content that might belong on the athletics website as opposed to social media. A YouTube account, of course, a digital channel, a blog, and podcast. I mean, those are just some examples of more specific digital channels that for those trying to build a program or grow a program, you want to be sure you have some awareness of all of those aspects. An important thing to consider here as well is the concept of impact versus output. We'll narrow this down more when I get to the social media specific section. But generally speaking, anytime you're trying to reach an audience, you'd rather provide impact as opposed to just trying to get something out there and have some certain quantity of items out there in the world. You want to make an audience feel like they're part of something and as a result want to be there And of course, the underlying, goal with that sort of approach, making the audience feel connected to the brand, feel like they're part of something, is then eventually they will want to buy tickets and be there in person. Again, a really effective way to reach an audience for this purpose is to encompass all digital channels, not just social media. In other words, social media channels alone cannot bear the burden of the entire program's marketing needs. There needs to be other channels, and there needs to be a broader strategy. In addition, in the digital space, you always want to know who your audience is and where you're reaching them. If I'm trying to advertise on a television program or a live sporting event, that's one type of audience and one method of communication compared to getting some ads up on the internet, or of course posting to social media. So understanding the different options, methods, channels by which you can reach an audience is very important. In addition, you need to define your audience. And again, this all does trickle down to social media accounts, but in the digital world, it's very big and vast, right? And there's a lot of new things that we're still kind of discovering as far as effective ways to utilize digital channels. But the who, what, when, where, and why is very important to consider when you're talking about an audience. Who is your audience? In many cases with us, it's fans, it's recruits, it's boosters, and families of current players. I mean, the current players themselves, right? So know who your audience is, know how, when, and where to reach them. The first idea that does come to mind is TikTok. I'll touch on this a little bit more in the social media section, but for the most part, we all know TikTok is where really everyone is these days, but especially that younger demographic. So not a bad idea to think, should me as a coach or our program or my staff, should they get a TikTok? So then knowing when and where, well, there you go, TikTok now, got it. Lastly, of course, knowing why you're reaching your audience. I think this applies to really any aspect of being a human, is you want to know your why. Sometimes I think we get really caught up in maybe competing with others out there in the digital world, or maybe we get so caught up with just trying to have quantity and just get stuff out instead of really stepping back and realizing, why are we doing this? Why are we pushing this? Is it reactionary? Is it proactive? So these are the conversations to really make sure you have at some point when you're considering your program in the digital space. The last kind of note here on this topic is just to remember you're dealing with humans. Your audience is humans. They are people who want to be entertained, engaged, and at times they just need to be provided important information. The more that you build this brand strategy and devote time and resources to building this brand strategy, the more credibility you'll build in the process. And the more your fans and your audience will know what to expect and be looking forward to that next opportunity to engage, to be entertained, or to receive some information. So that's kind of, again, a 10,000 foot view of this digital world. I think we're really only at the tip of the iceberg as far as the type of innovation, right? Creativity. I mean, look at where we're at right now, me presenting right now virtually, Zoom, how many Zoom meetings I've had, more in the past 2 weeks, than I think I even could have ever imagined. So the world is going in this direction, and it's not going to really go the opposite way. Digital is here to stay. It's been here a while, but now we're at the precipice of a really, really interesting shift in the evolution of this world. So having said all that, we will move on to social media best practices. Social media best practices with the goal of building and growing an audience on social. As with building anything, the first step is commitment and dedication. You want to make sure that you're, again, just committed to learning, to being open-minded, and to kind of studying the craft in some ways. Whether you're an individual or a brand account, there needs to be some level of commitment and effort, right, to really make this thing go. The next step is defining a clear yet adaptable vision. At the end of the day, as evidenced by events in our world the past 2 months, there's a lot of unpredictable things. In fact, recently I heard Mark Cuban say that he thinks life is half random. And that's why I use the word adaptable, because you want to have a clear vision of what your goals are on social media, but you want to understand that there are certain things that aren't in your control, you won't be able to do, you may need to build towards, etc. Kind of a big thing to remember when we're talking about all this stuff is we're talking about consumption habits. We're talking about the way a user will consume the content, the messaging that we're posting on our social media accounts. People consume most of their social media through their phones. And that is not going to change anytime soon. You want to be aware of what things look like from the desktop view, particularly Twitter and Facebook. But otherwise, a lot of things you need to be creating or posting, with mobile cell phone view in mind. 3 things to consider when building an audience on social media. Social media is free and open to the public. Over 2.9 billion people are on social media around the world. 2, there is not a rule book. Of course, you want to have a standard of ethics as far as what's appropriate and what's inappropriate. There are certain topics probably best to stay away from on social media. But at the end of the day, as far as creative and communicating your brand story and connecting to your audience, there's no rule book. Thirdly, there is a time and a place for most things, but the time and the place for most things is usually not all at once, right here, right now. Take a step back sometimes when you're brainstorming content ideas or trying to post on social and engage with your audience. A lot of times there's a lot more time in a more appropriate place to do the things that we want to do. Social media is ultimately a storytelling channel, not a ticket selling mechanism. You really want to consider on social media attention spans. I once heard the term 3-second strategy, and it was kind of crazy to think that there's a term for that, right? But that's where we're at. The 3-second strategy when it comes to video content, captioning on social, right? And maybe the dimensions of the creative in that post, whatever it might be. In those first 3 seconds, someone's scrolling. Part of that is the actual scroll motion, right? Are you able to kind of catch their attention and keep their attention at that point? And of course, social media is more saturated than ever. How can you differentiate yourself? And keep in mind, it does not always have to be these top of the line resources. In fact, a lot of the content that we'll post on social that has the most success is simply a cell phone video. I'm going to show some examples here now. So what's the point in trying to overthink how to deliver it? Just deliver that video, get it out, simple caption, and keep it moving. So definitely, cell phone content. Do not shy away from it, and do not be under the impression that if all you have to work with is a cell phone to create content for social media that you're behind. You can do some really creative things for sure. So now I want to go over a couple of best practices and specific techniques that you might be able to employ on social media. One of the first things I want to mention is hashtags. They're great, very much useful on social media, but they don't always work the way we think they do. I recommend keeping hashtag use to a minimum. And in my opinion, I don't think it's the most effective practice to use the same hashtag on every post. But again, that's definitely debatable. And at the end of the day, I kind of see both sides on that. Another thing to think about when you're posting on social media is the length of the captions. Again, as I said, there's a time and a place for everything, but ultimately I try to keep captions for Duke Women's Basketball 1 to 2 lines or less on Instagram. I'm just kind of flashing some examples of what I consider to be a well-crafted caption on the screen. Four tips I can share to kind of help the process of building a brand on social a little bit easier and the content creation process a little bit easier. One is make content easy for your audience to consume. In other words, make it easy for them to understand, meet them where they're at. Don't try to use overly fancy jargon or whatever. Curate your captions as if you're having a conversation with your audience. Again, at the end of the day, we're trying to build that emotional connection, that human connection. So employ that in your captions. Another way to make content easier for your audience to consume, and again, this is considering the size of a phone screen that they are most likely consuming this content on, is consider the dimensions, the size of a photo you might post. I always tell this story that when I first started at Duke, I really had no clue what was a metric to compare. I didn't know how to gauge if we were really growing in engagement or not. But one of the things I tried to do early on with my limited, knowledge and resources at the time was you can post a standard photo, 16:9 dimensions, and great, it might get whatever amount of likes it was getting. But then I was like, there has to be something else I can do here to increase engagement. So what I did was like zoom in and crop the photo and make it, more of a 9:16, more of a vertical photo that took up more room on the screen. So when the audience was scrolling, or this was my theory, the photo would be on their screen longer, and therefore they're more likely to double tap purely by, being on the screen longer. And sure enough, again, I don't know if I can directly prove that, but our engagement did start to go up. I started to notice higher engagement on our photos and even a growth in followers, way back when I first started. Secondly, you want to make your content easy for your audience to share. There's a couple examples I can share about this, but first and foremost, one of the bigger mistakes I see people make is they're so quick to date their content. They're so quick to say, tomorrow night, so-and-so, this is happening, whatever. And then 8 hours goes by and all of a sudden tomorrow night, which night? Tonight or the next one? Actually, obviously, yeah, your audience can go look at the date it was posted and like calculate which night you're actually referring to. But one, that's making your audience do way too much work. They're not going to do that. And two, that's like doing your audience a disservice. Make it easy for your audience to share. So keep your content relevant as long as that content can be relevant. Now, a birthday post clearly is only going to be relevant for 24 hours, not what I'm referring to. I'm just talking about a general content strategy. Another example of easy shareable type content is the classic, RT this tweet if, retweet this and you might get a shirt. Again, you don't want to do that too much because that also can be kind of cheap engagement, but that is a quick way to get some shareable content out there to help reach your audience, engage your audience, and grow your audience. The third thing I'll say is make content fit into what the audience was already going to be doing. This does not apply to all posts and all content, but there is a number that this is an important thing to consider. You don't want to come off like you're like so desperate for their attention, or you're so desperate for them to take action on whatever it is you're posting. Try to make it fit a little more into, again, what they were already going to be doing, what their habits were already going to be. The fourth tip I'll leave you with here is make content that makes the audience want to be a part of it. Here's an example of something I think did that. In this post, I just simply was saying, who wouldn't dream of shooting a shot like this against your rival in Cameron Indoor Stadium? And again, subconsciously, I think a lot of that is, wow, that is a bucket list thing. Here's another post, speaking of bucket lists, where I use that term to say, hey, what could be better than this? Another note, and this applies really to a personal account, but also a brand account. You underestimate what you know that people wish they could learn from you. So if I'm an individual and I'm a coach, my first thought is, if I'm a coach, I'm having some sort of regular messaging about, here's my philosophy on the court. Here's, why I love coaching these kids. Here's why like I'm kind of sharing. And again, it's just my thoughts. It's nothing super complex. I'm not overthinking. I'm not forcing anything, but every once in a while, I'm going to share my thoughts and kind of look at myself as like a thought leader almost in my space. And again, everyone has something to offer, especially as a coach, as a support staff member, a staff member. You have a lot to offer, even just as a human, of course. Like, people just want to connect with humans, and that definitely applies to individual accounts. So again, you underestimate what you know that people wish they could learn from you. I want to talk about really quickly video views and some analytic thoughts with social media. So people always, I think video views are a little misunderstood at times. They're a very valuable metric. I prefer our video view metrics to some of our just like metrics on social media. But keep in mind, video views, they really do only measure the first 3 seconds of viewership. Still an important metric because it indicates the kind of reach you might have. And again, there is a certain percentage of your audience that is actually watching that video content, but you just want to keep that type of thing in perspective. Some other analytics thoughts on that same note is numbers don't lie. Very important to kind of track analytics even in a basic way if you're trying to build a brand. Again, how am I going to try to improve a player's, free throw percentage if I'm not even tracking the free throws and not even tracking where she was a month ago, 2 months ago, et cetera. So same concept here. And even going further with that is if I'm trying to improve a player's, left hand or offhand, they're going to be doing drills and working on their craft. You got to kind of look at social media and creative content and brand development in a similar fashion. Social media is not a full-time job for most people, but you still want to approach it a similar way you approach really anything else in your life. If you're a competitor, this is very much an avenue to improve and get better. I'm going to dive into some platform specific content thoughts here. I'm going to really stick to Twitter, Instagram. I'll touch on Facebook and touch briefly on TikTok. And then we'll kind of get going into the next segment. So Twitter best practices is definitely going to be building a voice, again, that's conversational in nature. You want to use proper grammar. You don't have to always use punctuation. That's a strategy in itself, is do you use punctuation or not in certain cases. For those who don't know, I actually have this position from a direct message on Twitter. One of our coaches messaged me, and at first I thought was just asking for like a freelance flyer or graphic for the program. And then turned out they were looking to hire a full-time position to do what I do. I think a lot of why that direct message came to my inbox is because, all along I was favoriting people's tweets that I genuinely liked. I was replying to people, giving them kudos, shouting them out. Oh, that was dope. Oh, I agree. Obviously kind of following folks that you think, might follow you back. There's some of that game going on too. But it really was because I was just genuinely engaging with people almost as if, I was in person with them. Just, hey, this is kind of like I've heard it referred to as the biggest sports bar in the world, right? Twitter. So definitely engage, like meet us halfway here. You're trying to build an audience. Okay, we'll engage with them first, right? Instagram is very much visually driven. So high quality visuals at the end of the day is kind of like the baseline to build an audience on Instagram. That's not to say you need a professional photographer and all this, at every single event your program might do or have, but definitely considering, like, if it's cell phone content, a photo or a video, did you take that extra step to crop it, recenter it, maybe resize it? You can do some basic photo editing on your phone. Again, take those extra steps. As I said, that's that commitment and dedication that I led this segment off with, that you kind of have to have. Like there's not many excuses to not be able to improve the quality of your visuals on Instagram. Instagram stories, I always say if I had an intern or a GA, I would pretty much give them that as like a whole project to just develop. I don't quite have the time to dedicate to Instagram stories what it really is capable of being for us. Now we're pretty happy to always have something up there on our story, whether it's we're just sharing whatever we posted and kind of letting that speak for itself, almost acting as a retweet on Instagram. Facebook, I will mention Facebook. Again, that really is where like family and friends reside, but definitely a very important, kind of home base for some of our fans that operate mostly on Facebook and might not be on the Twitter or Instagram kick right now. So we just kind of we're sure to post any article on Facebook, video content, graphic content, photo content as well, but just not as intense by any means as our Twitter and Instagram strategy. TikTok, I mentioned that earlier. It's kind of hard to avoid at this point. We technically do have a Duke WBB TikTok account. It's just pretty dormant right now. I do have some ideas. I think I'm starting to be converted to almost a TikTok creator, or at least I'm trying. So hopefully we'll get some stuff going on that soon, but I think that is an easy app for individuals, coaches, and players to just get on it. Overall, social media is very powerful, and we definitely encourage our players and staff to be active. We don't force them by any means. At the end of the day, there's a real world outside of social media, and that's what matters the most, is that you're developing as a real human, right, in reality. Social media is kind of a more passive name. Always remember it's social media as well as social networking. That's an active way to put it. So it's a two-way street when you talk about networking, right? But at the end of the day, again, I'm here at Duke. I've been here now. This is my third season, all through a Twitter direct message. So with that, I'll kind of wrap this segment up and we'll get going on storytelling for programs and student athletes. The last topic I want to talk about today is the art of storytelling, using personal and brand accounts to engage an audience and tell a story. To tell a story, the first thing you need to be able to do is evoke a reaction, to evoke emotion from your audience. You won't be able to do that if there really isn't a connection or human element to what you're doing. You need to define your brand story. Sit back and have a conversation about what that might be for you. It needs to be told in a way that involves your audience and your community and makes people feel like they're part of the story. Once you do that, you will be able to evoke reactions from your audience. You want to know your audience, you want to know what makes you unique, you want to connect and engage with fans. Remember, you're dealing with humans, as I've said, and also that humans have attention spans. You will never or rarely have 100% of someone's attention. Tell your story anyways. Don't try to tell someone else's story and don't try to be something you're not. At the end of the day, you've got to figure out what makes you unique and stick to that. When telling a story, it's easy to get wrapped up in trying to almost create the story before it really occurs. And that's not going to get you very far. Really, you want to shift your mindset a little bit to the concept of letting the story tell itself and then document it as it occurs. Be prepared with various techniques to tell the story, the way you tweet, the way you post to Instagram, the way you share to your story, etc. But at the end of the day, you want to document. You don't necessarily want to create a story. You want to deliver valuable content to your audience that only you can deliver. If I'm an individual, again, if I'm a coach, if I'm a student athlete, I have a lot to share just by the nature of my position. Provide the value to your audience and see the return in the form of genuine relationships and authentic connections. When you're trying to build a brand, whether you're building a programs account or working with your student athletes on their individual accounts, you want to communicate with your team early and often. Now, what do I mean by team? I mean, who is on your social team, in your athletics department, in your program? Are there people dedicated to your social accounts? Are there people dedicated to creative content? What is the department structure for social and creative? Additionally, do you have grad assistants? Can you tap into your student body for help? These are questions to ask to put your program in a better position to tell a story and your student athletes in a position to tell a story. When you're kind of working with this group of people within your department or your program, you may have to deal with conflict. Of course, there's going to be some old school thinking versus some new school thinking. There will be people who take the criticism you might provide personally. At the end of the day, just be prepared when you're kind of leading this charge. You're going to have to deal with some conflict. But as I've said before, numbers don't lie, results don't lie, engagement doesn't lie. So continue to think outside the box, communicate early and often, and really try to build this structure behind the scenes to help tell the story. I want to talk about the concept of time when it comes to storytelling a little bit. There absolutely are instances where the content, the story is time sensitive. For example, if you win or lose the game, you kind of got to get that out right then and there. I don't believe there's any rule on you have to post about a win this way, you have to post about a loss that way. At the end of the day, give your audience more credit that they kind of already know what's going on, at least on the court, right? But the concept of time is simply me saying, try to tell the story as it's occurring in the long term. Understand that you don't need to tell every single detail right here, right now, in this moment. We're used to in sports having a start and a finish, right? A beginning of the season and an end of the season. But when you talk about storytelling, there really is no beginning or end. You're simply telling the story as it's unfolding, as long as it's going to unfold. Student athletes have a much bigger platform now than ever before, and that will not change. You may as well embrace it. You may as well educate yourself, educate your team, educate your staff on this world as much as you can, and really use it to your advantage. at the end of the day, you have to know your story. You have to know what makes you unique, and you have to know your audience well enough to know what are effective ways to tell our story. So that wraps up my virtual presentation here. Again, the last segment there, just a brief overview of storytelling from a concept standpoint, and some things to think about when you are trying to ultimately tell a story in order to engage an audience. Thank you so much for tuning in. Again, I hope everyone was able to get a little something out of this. Try to cover a lot of information, but keep it short, concise, and easy to understand. If anyone has any questions ever, please feel free to reach out to me. On Twitter is probably the easiest way. Just shoot me a direct message. My handle is at selenarcastillo. Again, I'm always happy to engage, particularly with coaches really trying to figure this stuff out and build a brand. Thank you again to the WBCA. Thank you for your time that you're spending here with me. Look forward to seeing everyone next year in San Antonio. Peace.